Hello there, Ben Bowers, the Spirit Specialist, and I'm here today to talk to you about Bourbon Bourbon. Or is it Bourbon Bourbon? Or is it Bourbon Bourbon? Or is it Bourbon Bourbon? No, it's Bourbon Bourbon, and I'm going to tell you why in a minute. So I've had my eye on this for a while. This is produced by Atom Brands, who are the same people that do the Jaffa Cake, vodka, gin, rum. And you might have seen the video in which I tried all three side by side and came to the conclusion that the vodka was absolutely fantastic. The gin, the rum were okay, but I now have the Jaffa Cake vodka in the shop because I think it is brilliant. And I was really excited to see what this is like, but I wanted to try it first. I really like Bourbon biscuits, which I've got some here. I've got a pack of Tesco's because Bourbon biscuits are brilliant. They're like really cheap and they're incredibly tasty. So I really like Bourbon biscuits. I really like bourbon whiskey. Combine the two, it should be an absolute winner. But I wanted to try it first just in case it didn't quite work. I managed to try it. It is now in the shop, which gives you an indication that I like it. However, it's not quite what you would expect it to be. So before I tell you why it's not quite what you would expect it to be, let me give you a bit of background information about the Bourbon biscuit itself, because I was doing a bit of research and actually it's pretty damn interesting.
The Bourbon biscuit was invented in 1910 by the Peak Freen cake and biscuit manufacturer based in Bermondsey, London. Founded in 1857, Peak Freen created other well-known biscuits such as the Garibaldi, and the chocolate cream-filled biscuit sandwich was originally named the Crayola until 1930. At this point, Dr. Hans Zenlock was working for Cadbury's R&D department in Bournville near Birmingham and refined the design and recipe for the Crayola, renaming it the Bourbon biscuit. Now, there's some contrasting information as to the reason behind this name. Some resources will tell you it's named after the House of Bourbon, a French dynasty dating back to the mid-13th century, which made the biscuit sound more exotic and interesting than Crayola. However, other evidence points to the name being an amalgamation of Bournville, the employee village built by Cadbury for its employees, and Bonn, the town where Zenlock himself was born. Yet another source cites the name coming from the fact that top quality butter was used to make the biscuits, which in French was known as burr-bun. Who knows, perhaps the truth is a combination of all three. The Bourbon name was never trademarked, so Bourbon biscuits can be made by any manufacturer. However, there are several factors of the biscuit which remain consistent throughout each version. The printing of the word Bourbon in the middle, the rectangular shape, although you can find other shapes being used on rare occasions, and the holes around the edge. Zenlock added these holes to stop the biscuits expanding too much while being baked, maintaining a consistent crunch and texture. Zenlock in German literally translates as 10 holes, so a true Bourbon biscuit should have 5 holes on the top and 5 holes on the bottom. Bourbon Bourbon is produced by Atom Brands, a drinks producer that's part of the Atom Group, who also own Master of Malt and Maverick Drinks. Indeed, the Atom Group itself was bought out by a subsidiary of AB InBev in 2018. Bourbon whiskey from an unknown distillery and at an unknown age is infused with actual Bourbon biscuits and blended with dark chocolate and vanilla for added flavour and character. It's bottled at 40.4% ABV.
Okay, so this is my personal bottle that I ended up. I'm now experimenting with cocktails and things like that because it needs some playing around with, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But the reason I am calling it Bourbon Bourbon is because I am working on the story that the naming of Bourbon is based on Bournville and Bonn. Bournville, where Zenlock was in Cadbury's R&D department, and Bonn, his hometown. Bourbon, the kind of burr-bun, good butter, best butter, yeah, not too sure about that. And it just seems a little bit odd that somebody would go, oh, I want to rename this biscuit, I want to make it sound posh. Oh, let's name it after some French dynasty which had kings and queens and all sorts of stuff like that. It's a little bit too tenuous for me. Plus, you already had bourbon whiskey, so it just seems a little bit odd that you kind of go with that connotation. I don't know. It's possible. It's entirely possible that that is the reason. But the Bournville-Bonn connection tying in with Zenlock kind of makes sense to me. So that's why, for me, it's a bourbon biscuit and bourbon whiskey, because Bourbon, Kentucky, is named after because of the links with, it's something to do, I don't think it's the French Civil War, but there is some links with, and I think it's some battles or something like that with that particular French dynasty. Anyway, so bourbon biscuits, bourbon whiskey. Throughout this review, I will probably get the two of them mixed up. However, What about the actual drink itself? So, if you watch the Jaffa Cake review of the vodka gin and everything, it was really, really obvious on the nose that Jaffa Cakes were involved. Bang, straight up front. And the vodka in particular was, this smells like Jaffa Cakes, it tastes like Jaffa Cakes. It is exactly what it says on the tin. So my worry was, before tasting this, was that it would be too sweet, too chocolatey. So bourbon biscuits are, I've literally just done it. Bourbon biscuits. Bourbon biscuits are chocolatey, but there is a kind of a sugary sweetness to it. I don't know if you can see, but you do tend to get, now this isn't even Tesco Finest. This is a Tesco bog standard bourbon biscuit. But what you do tend to find is like a kind of not a sugar crust as such, but the majority of them do have like these sugar crystals in as well. Genuine bourbon biscuit, because it's got the 10 holes on it. So there is a biscuity sweetness, but it's not massively chocolatey. It's a very Moorish biscuit, but it's not in-your-face chocolate, and that kind of soft, sugary, flowery sweetness tempers everything down. So the danger is with the bourbon is that it becomes either way too sweet, or the chocolate element becomes a bit artificial, because there are a lot of chocolate flavored kind of gins and rums and everything out there, and outside of the ones that have really spent a lot of time on it and are really doing it properly using natural chocolate flavors, as soon as you start using artificial chocolate flavors, it starts to taste awful. And it starts to taste like these £1 advent calendars that you get. I think like Kinnerton chocolate is the cheap one. And it barely tastes of chocolate. It kind of tastes a bit like slightly burnt cardboard. It's really bizarre stuff. If you ever watch Friends, there was an episode where Monica was involved in a company that were making mocklet. Now, obviously, it's a TV show. You don't actually get to taste mocklet watching it. But all the descriptions and the ways that people were reacting when they were trying mocklet is what I imagine some of these artificially flavoured rums and gins actually taste like now. There's this weird artificial plasticky burnt note to it, which is completely disgusting and not like chocolate at all. There was a danger that it goes down that route. Now, according to Atom, they are actually infusing proper real life bourbon biscuits as well as dark chocolate and vanilla. Now, given how kind of natural how naturally flavoured the Jaffa Cake, not like Jaffa Cake is a natural thing, but you know, the Jaffa Cake vodka really does taste like they have involved Jaffa Cakes through the distillation process. So I'm inclined to kind of believe Atom that they have done some kind of work with maybe, well, not vacuum distillation, because they do talk about it's blended, is it blended? Infused with real life bourbon biscuits. So apparently, according to the front label, real life, no fooling bourbon biscuits. So, bourbon biscuits, I've done it again. It's bourbon biscuits, Ben. Come on, get with it. This is the problem. So, I am inclined to believe that they are actually infusing the biscuits. I don't think the cream. I think it is literally just the biscuits have been sat in the whiskey for a set amount of time. They have also done dark chocolate, maybe cocoa nibs, something like that, and vanilla. So maybe vanilla pods, that sort of thing. And they've done a light filtration to it, maybe just to kind of like knock the colour down a little bit, that sort of thing. But I'm inclined to believe, having gone through the Jaffa Cake range, that they are actually doing what they say on the label, and it's not artificially flavoured. Who knows? But what's that going to do to the whiskey? Now, I don't know what the base whiskey is. I don't know how old it is. It says it's Kentucky. In one of the resources that I read about, it actually said it was from Tennessee, but it says Kentucky on the label, so I'm assuming it's Kentucky. Barton, Willett, who the hell knows? And I also don't know what the mash bill is, everything like that. So having said, let me tell you what it tastes like, I've just spent a couple of minutes not telling you what it tastes like. So let's go right into the nose. Not what it tastes like, what it smells like. Now, there is a instant chocolatey feel, but whereas with the Jaffa Cakes it was boom Jaffa Cake, this is much more subtle. There is chocolate, but there's also spice. You can tell that there is whiskey. It's interesting, it's soft, it feels, it noses like it's quite thick, and there is that sort of soft biscuit note. Now, I have bourbons. Now that smells a little bit drier, but it still has, I cannot believe I am nosing a bourbon biscuit on camera. What has my life come into? Now it's a little bit drier, but there is this soft, slightly sweet, chocolatey, biscuity note. Well, Ben, you're holding a bourbon biscuit under your nose. Of course it is. Kind of difficult to put it into some kind of context because on the nose, you get that. Slightly less burnt is the wrong word. You know, this has been baked. There's not quite the baked element in the nose, but there is a biscuity, crumbly biscuity note to it. And it's really, really hard to kind of figure out how that's coming through and even how to describe it. But it's not obvious. This is the thing. If I was given this blind and somebody said to me like, right, what is this? I'd probably actually, so there's Westwood single malt, which is the shelf above where you can see on the camera. And they use, I think, chocolate malt in it. And there is a chocolatey note to that. And I would be very, very inclined to go, do you know what? I think this is a single malt, not Scotch, that's used chocolate malt. Or maybe an American blended whiskey that's used chocolate rye as well as malt. You get that richness of the malt, but you get that chocolate as well. But I would not have said it's bourbon biscuits. I've done it again. Bourbon biscuits. This is going to drive me absolutely nuts. I would not obviously say it's bourbon biscuits as opposed to the Jaffa Cake vodka, where straight away this is Jaffa Cakes. This is much more subtle, much more refined, much more allowing the whiskey element to come through. You do get that soft spice from what you would consider a classic kind of bourbon whiskey. It's really, really interesting and absolutely not what I was expecting. So, does that continue on the palate? Absolutely it does. The chocolate notes, again, it tastes like chocolate malt. It's almost less bourbon biscuits and more kind of like chocolate Horlicks. And it really coats the mouth, particularly on the finish. It feels like you eat one of these babies, you get that residue around your mouth, and it kind of like gives it like a finish on the biscuit. And that you have the residue of that like chocolatey, you know, you've crunched it between your teeth, there's a bit of residue of the biscuit and the chocolate cream. And you can kind of taste it on your tongue and feel it on the inside of your mouth. There's kind of like a thick kind of residue on the inside of your mouth in a very, very pleasant way. And weirdly, it's here as well. You swallow and it lingers on the mouth like there's still a little bit left. But to start with, it's more whiskey. It's not obvious that chocolate is involved. It really evolves from, there's a little bit of sugary sweetness to start with, just a touch, almost instant. And then it becomes a decent bourbon whiskey, bourbon whiskey, bourbon whiskey. It's got a bit of spice to it. It's got quite a bit of vanilla, and they've obviously added vanilla to it. So it is very much a like vanillin forward bourbon whiskey. And then the chocolate comes through more in kind of like the last quarter, and then also on the finish as well. It's not in your face. It's very, very drinkable. My worry is that if you gave this to somebody saying, this is a bourbon whiskey that's been infused with bourbon biscuits, it's not obvious enough for some people that would want it more full on, more chocolatey, more sweet. But the danger with that is that it ends up becoming too sweet, too cloying, too sickly. So they've actually done a very clever way of balancing the flavours, but it's almost, it's a bit like it's a little bit too close to the middle ground. It's the the bourbon biscuit influence is there, but not enough for some people. But enough for me, because I like the fact that they haven't gone too full on with it. I like the fact they've held it back a bit and actually allowed the whiskey, the bourbon whiskey, to still be present, to not be dominated by that bourbon biscuit influence, to not be dominated by chocolate and sweetness and vanilla and sugar and everything like that that's involved with one of these babies. There is still obviously whiskey involved in it. I really want to play around with this. I've already done some old fashions, so it's only been a few days since I opened the bottle, and I've already had a bit out of it because I've been trying. There is an old fashioned that will absolutely knock the socks off using this. I just need to kind of get the balances right. The bitters as well is also important. So the syrup, less so. This isn't going to work with something like the smoked maple syrup that I've got. That's absolutely amazing for old fashions. But it's not going to work with this. We need to go that slightly chocolatey route, and also orange. So orange bitters, it needs an orange peel in it as well. I'm just trying to figure out the syrup to do with it as well. I'm kind of playing around. It's definitely going down like a chocolate orange old-fashioned route. It's just, what do I do to kind of get that? Now, it's already got enough sweetness to it as it is. So you don't want to go simple syrup, because this is sweet enough. There is a sweetness to this that's inherent with it, that if you just put simple syrup in, it's going to get too sweet. Maybe something like triple sec. Not necessarily curacao, maybe a dry curacao, but like a triple sec or something like that, that's going to give you a lighter sweetness as well as the fruitiness, and then orange bitters, and then orange peel as well. So you get like a chocolate orange bourbon old fashioned. I just need to get the quantities right, the proportions. I haven't yet nailed it. I might also go down the cherry route as well, because the chocolate cherry I think could work really well. But it's got the scope to be playing around with it. It's definitely a cocktail whiskey, absolutely, but it does sit really neat. Really well neat. I really like this. I think this is interesting. I like the fact it's not gone too overboard. That was the danger that was going to happen. But it's not, I don't think, to everybody's taste. I think the chocolatey element is going to put some people off, and I don't think it's going to have enough of an influence for some people of the bourbon biscuits, but they're probably people that want to go more towards that almost liqueur route. It would be very interesting if they did this as a whiskey liqueur. I don't think they will, but I think there'll be people that will be more inclined to going, oh, a bourbon liqueur at like 25%, something like that, and they really go more, they lean more into that chocolatey, sugary, sweet, biscuity note. What they've done here is they've balanced it really well. They've clearly thought about it, and they've clearly wanted to go, right, we want to highlight the whiskey as well as have the influence of the bourbon biscuit. And I think they've done a cracking job. I just think it's one of those that people are going to think it's going to be going somewhere else. So, available through the website, www.spiritspecialist.com. At the moment, $34.99. I think it's supposed to be normally $39.99. I've not put it on a price cut as such, but I think I've managed to get some on a decent price, and it's working out at $34.99. So that's me done. I'm going to have this for my breakfast, and I shall see you in the next video. Cheers. Oh, that's so nice.